Now, the third component, rewarding success and tackling failure. The important point here is that most schools in Latin America face no consequences for underperforming. You can overperform, you can underperform, there just aren't any consequences. Good teachers are not paid more than bad teachers. Those teachers who aren't doing well are not typically selected for remedial attention. They're not sanctioned. They're not removed from the classroom. Students in Latin America typically are allowed to graduate from high school without having to demonstrate that they've reached the requisite levels of knowledge on core subjects like math, reading, science. Schools are going to get funded year in and year out regardless of whether they improve student achievement. You don't have to worry about getting your money next year. You can do what you want and you're still going to get funded. Unlike think tanks like CaPRI. So there are virtually no incentives in the Latin American public school system for good performance. That's the most important idea here. Now, if you look at some of these mechanisms, moving to the next slide, quality contracts, there are some, and I'm not going to, since time is short, I'm not going to go into the details of these, but there are some very interesting experience with establishing quality contracts in Latin America, particularly in Bogota, Colombia. If you look in the next slide at community participation, there are also some very interesting experiments, particularly in the poorest countries in the region, in Central America, with giving more power to school councils to make decisions, including decisions about hiring and firing teachers and salary levels. So there are some interesting experiments there. If you look at school choice, what's interesting there is that there's almost nothing in the next slide, almost nothing in Latin America. The big exception is Chile, which has had a voucher program for 20-some years, which allows parents, regardless of their socioeconomic status, poor parents, can use public money to send children to the school of their choice if they can get the child admitted to that school, private or public. And Colombia did have a voucher program, but had to drop it in the late 90s because of political controversy. If you look at teacher management innovations, Chile has some interesting experiments. Mexico has an interesting experiment. I'm not going to try to talk about Mexico since we have someone who'll be, Dr. Santibáñez will be talking about that. Sao Paulo, Brazil has just started a very interesting and challenging teacher management reform, which will reward top performing schools according to various criteria. So there's some interesting issues there. Okay, I think, John, my time is probably up.
No, go ahead. This is
okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead to the next slide. Some general comments on what relatively successful systems are doing. And this is worldwide, and it comes from a global report that was published recently, the McKinsey report. Generally speaking, top-performing school systems have robust accountability mechanisms in place. They vary in different ways, but they tend to be strong. And these school systems tend to attract the best students graduating from teachers' colleges or universities to become teachers. They tend to, in a very hands-on way, develop these students into effective instructors. They don't just put them in school and hope they do well. They really develop them. And they provide immediate help to students who are falling behind. They don't let kids fall behind. They intervene early and they intervene very strongly. What's interesting is that having allowed the states to set their own standards, those standards vary quite a bit. Some states set very high learning standards, Other states set relatively low learning standards. And there's a lot of debate about that. There's a lot of criticism of it, but that's the situation. We're a decentralized system. The No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 set minimum learning standards for certain demographic groups, typically those groups such as blacks and Hispanics who don't perform as well as other groups in the country. And if schools bring those groups up to the level that they're supposed to be at, they get access to funds from the federal government. If they fail to do so, not only do they not get access to the fund, but they face a series of consequences, which can include dismissing all of the teachers and the principal and completely reorganizing the school and starting over. Also, there is an emerging consensus in the United States on the use of value-added models to measure school performance. The issue here is, the question is, how much value or how much learning do teachers add to the students? And they measure the students sort of at the beginning of the year and again at the end of the year, and how much have they learned over that period. And there's a lot of experimentation on this because it isn't clear how to do this. And so a fund has been set up to allow states to experiment with value-added models. There are some research results that are at least modestly positive about this, but clearly the devil is in the details. And so far, people have not figured out the best way to do this. In terms of, to the next slide, in terms of rewarding success and tackling failures, and under the category of quality contracts, it's worth realizing that the United States has a robust charter school movement. And charter schools are public schools which are managed sort of outside the public system. Typically, they can be a company that manages them. They can be a community group that manages them. You can set up a charter school. You have to meet certain requirements in order to do so, but if you meet those requirements, you can establish a charter school. And parents can opt to take their children out of a traditional public school and send them to the charter school, and the government money that would have been given to that public school goes with that child to the charter school, roughly. This is a very dynamic movement. There are networks of charter schools. I mentioned several there. It's interesting that where I live in the District of Columbia in Washington, roughly 30% of the enrollment now of public schools is in charter schools because parents are fed up with the public system and they're looking for alternatives. And when they get those alternatives, they take their child out and put their child in a charter school. Also, the U.S. has a very strong tradition of community participation. I'm going to jump over this because we really are running out of time. And go to the next slide.